Hello math friends. Today in our video we're going to be taking a look at some operations with rational numbers, and our operations are going to be covering adding and subtracting rational numbers with positive numbers and negative numbers. So positive and negative rational numbers, that means there's going to be fractions involved, and there's going to be decimals involved. So we're going to have a great time. So let's start off. What we have here is a hiking trail map, and on this hiking trail map, you can see on this side over here we have an elevation scale that tells the elevation of the different features of our map. So we've got the beginning of the trail is at negative 60 feet. So that's 60 feet below sea level. There's a water fountain at negative 40.25 feet below sea level. The picnic area is at sea level. And the benches are at 43 3/4 feet above sea level. The waterfall is at 60.5 feet above sea level. The overlook is at 70 feet. And the telescopes clear at the top are at 80.5 feet above sea level. And so we're going to be using this elevation map to practice our operations with rational numbers. So let's get started. First of all, let's look at this question. The very first question says, the change in elevation from the beginning of the trail to the telescopes is how many feet? Well, let's see here. So we're looking at the beginning of the trail to the telescopes. Okay? So the elevation, the change in elevation. Now you can see that the change in elevation, we are going up, right? So that should be a positive change in elevation. But here's the thing. When we talk about the change in elevation, we are actually talking about the difference between the two elevations. And when we talk about difference means that we are going to subtract. So we're going to be subtracting the values of those two spots, the telescopes and the beginning of the trail. Now this is where it gets weird, because we're trying to find the difference between those, and it says the difference from the beginning of the trail to the telescopes. We actually have to subtract the elevation at the telescopes, which is 80.5. And we're going to subtract the elevation of the beginning of the trail, which is negative 60. So 80.5 minus negative 60. Now, if you were paying attention when we were learning about integers, remember when we are subtracting, we are adding the opposite. So what this actually becomes, if we're going to add the opposite, this would be 80.5 plus the opposite of negative 60 is 60. Right? Okay, so we're adding the opposite, and so when we add the opposites, we're just going to add 80.5 and 60. Now, 80.5 plus, now 60, remember you need to line up decimals when you're adding decimals. 60 doesn't have a decimal, and a lot of people will just be tempted to just write it over here. But you remember, if there's no decimal, you have to place a decimal at the end of it. So that's 60 is 60.0. Okay, now we can add those because the decimals are lined up. And we just add 5 plus 0, bring our decimal straight down, 0 plus 0, and 8 plus 6. So the difference, the change in elevation from the beginning of the trail to the telescopes is 140.5 feet. Okay, now let's look at our next one. What's the change in elevation from the telescopes to the trail's beginning? Now, wait a minute. That's just asking us to go the opposite direction, from the telescopes down to the trail's beginning. Now, you can see that we're going downhill. The elevation is going down, so we know that's going to be a negative number, but let's make sure we're doing this right so we understand what's happening. So remember, we're trying to find the change in elevation, which is the difference, and when it's a difference, we are going to subtract. So, the first thing I'm going to do is put the trail's beginning, which is negative 60, and then I'm going to subtract the telescope's elevation, which is 80.5. All right, now when I do that, I'm adding the opposite, right? Subtraction is adding the opposite. So negative 60 stays the same, but I'm going to add the opposite of 80.5, which is negative 80.5. Now that doesn't change, well, it does change stuff, but what you can see here is now we are adding two negative numbers. We're adding the opposites of these two. So if I just put negative sign and negative sign there, negative 80.5 plus negative 60, I'm adding two negative numbers. I'm just going to end up with a larger negative number. So that would be negative 140.5 feet, negative. And that makes sense because we were going downhill. And when you're going downhill, that's negative change in elevation. All right. Let's move to the third question. The change in elevation, so again, we are looking for the change in elevation from the overlook to the water fountain. So let's see, we're going from the overlook, which is at 70 feet, to the water fountain. So the overlook down to the water fountain. So remember, when we want to find the change in elevation between those two things, we have to subtract the end point. So the end point is the water fountain, and its elevation is negative 40.25. And we're going to subtract the starting point, which was the overlook, and that's at 70. Okay, so negative 40.25 minus 70. All right, subtraction, right, because we're finding the change in elevation, which is the difference, which means we're going to subtract negative 40 minus 70. Subtraction is adding the opposite, so that's negative 40 plus the opposite of 70, which is, not negative 40, my apologies, 40.25, plus the opposite of 70, which is negative 70. I'm adding two negatives. So, of course, when I add two negatives together, I'm just going to have a larger negative. So I'm just going to add 40.25 and 70. Now notice 70 doesn't have a decimal. I can't just throw it there. No. I have to put a decimal after the 70. So that means it goes there. So I'm adding negative 40.25 and negative 70. Adding two negatives is just going to give me more negatives. So let's see, 5, and there's 2. Bring my decimal straight down. There is 0, and 4 and 7 is 11. 110.25, but that's going to be negative. And that makes sense because we are going down from the from the overlook to the water fountain. Negative 110.25 feet. Okay. And how about this last one, the change in elevation from the water fountain to the benches. So the change in elevation from the water fountain to the benches. So we are ending at the benches. The benches are at 43 and 3/4. So 43 and 3/4. And the water fountain is negative 40.25. Okay, so let's remember, we're finding the change in elevation, which is finding the difference. Difference means we're subtracting, that's why we have it set up like this. But what is subtraction? Subtraction is adding the opposite. So this is going to be 43 and 3/4 plus the opposite of 40.25 is positive 40.25. Okay, now here's the problem. 43 and 3/4 is a fraction. We're trying to add it to a decimal. What do? Well, we have to change 43 and 3/4 to a decimal. That's the easiest thing to do. So I'm going to go over here. So this is what I'm changing, 43 and 3/4. I'm going to change it to a decimal. So first thing I have to do is change this mixed number into an improper fraction, so I'm going to multiply 43 times 4. You know what? I'm not going to change it to an improper fraction because I know that 43 and 3/4, that's 43, that's going to be my whole number. And then I only have to change the 3/4 to a decimal. So I'm going to divide 3 by 4. 3 divided by 4. Remember, the numerator always goes inside. 4 goes into 3 0 times. I put my decimal there, bring my decimal up there, add a 0, and now I divide 4 into 30. 4 goes into 30 7 times. 4 multiplied by 7 is 28. And 30 minus 28, well, let's see, 28, 29, 30. So that's just 2. So I bring another 0 down. And 4 goes into 20. 4 times 5, and that's 20. 20 minus 20 is 0. So 3/4 is 0.75. So 43 and 3/4 is 43.75. And I'm going to add to that the 40.25. And when I do that, I get, let's see, 5 and 5 is 10, carry the 1. 7 plus 2 is 9, plus 1 is 10, carry the 1, don't forget the decimal. 3 and 1 is 4, and 4 and 4 is 8. So the distance, the change in elevation between the water fountain to the benches is 84 feet. Okay, well, that's some great practice. And what's better than practice? More practice. That's right, you guessed it, more practice. Let's take a look at a few more problems. Oh, we've got our friend Todd. It says that Todd hiked from the beginning of the trail to the benches. Beginning of the trail up to the benches. What was his change in elevation? So, again, change in elevation is finding the difference. And then that means that we are going to subtract. So when we find the difference, we are subtracting. So, beginning of the trail to the benches. That means we're going to subtract the elevation at the benches, 43 and 3/4, minus the beginning of the trail, which is negative 60. Now, the great thing about this is we've already established what 43 and 3/4 is. We know that so much already. It's 43.75. We did that in the previous practice. So 43.75. And we're going to add the opposites. We're going to add the opposite of negative 60, which is 60. And let's see, so what would that be? 43.75 plus 60. Whoop, 60 doesn't have a decimal. We're going to throw a decimal on there. So over here, we do 43.75 plus 60.00. Fill in those gaps. And 5 and 0, 7 and 0, bring my decimal straight down. I've got 3, and then 4, and 6 is 10. So the change in elevation from where he hiked to the other spot is 103.75 feet. Okay? Now, from the benches, it says from the benches, Todd hiked to the telescopes. So now we're going from the benches up to the telescopes. So, benches, telescopes, change in elevation, difference, subtract. Telescopes is the end point, so we're going to subtract 80.5 minus 43 and 3/4. The beauty part is we already know how much 43 and 3/4 is, so we can change this to 80.5 minus 43.75. And now, well, this is just basic subtraction, right? We don't have to add the opposite. We're just subtracting two positive numbers. But let's go take care of this over here. 80.5 subtract 43.75. Take care to line up the decimals. And we fill in our empty spaces with zeros. Now, I know that a lot of people would be tempted to go 0 minus 5 is 5. That's not necessarily true, right? So we can't subtract 0 minus 5. We have to borrow from the 5. That becomes 4. And 0 becomes 10. 10 minus 5 is 5. And then we go 4 minus 7. We can't do that, so we have to borrow. We can't borrow from 0, so we have to borrow from the 8. 8 becomes 7. 0 becomes 10, but we have to borrow from that 10, and that becomes 9. And so 4 becomes 14. Whew. 14 minus 7 is 7. Decimal. 9 minus 3 is 6, and 7 minus 4 is 3. So 36.75 is the change in elevation. So from the benches to the telescopes, it is 36.75 feet in elevation. Okay? I think we have one more. Now this says that Todd's friend Jamal hiked from the waterfall to the benches. So the waterfall to the benches, and from there he hiked to the water fountain. What was his total change in elevation? Oh man. So let's see here. Let's shrink this down just a second. So we're going from the waterfall to the benches to the water fountain. The water fountain is our ending spot. So I'm going to put it first. Negative 40.25. Subtract the benches, which is 43 3/4. And then I'm going to subtract then the waterfall, which is our starting point, which is 60.5. Okay? And keep in mind that subtraction is adding the opposite. So I'm going to change this to negative 40.25. I'm going to add negative 43 3/4. And I'm going to add negative 60.5. And now I go, all right, perfect. Negative 40.25 plus negative 43.75, because we know what that is. And then most people, and you should know that anytime you've got half, that's the same thing as 0.5, right? So that would be negative 60.5. That's one that everyone should know. All right, so now I'm adding negative 40.25 to negative 43.75 to negative 60.5. I'm going to add all those negative numbers up. So 40.25 negative 43.75, and negative 60.5. And I'm going to tack on a 0 there to fill in that empty spot. Add up all these negatives. 5 and 5 is 10, carry my 1. 1 and 2 is 3, plus 7 is 10, plus 5 is 15. Decimal, carry my 1. 1 and 0 and 3 and 0 is 4. And 4 plus 4 is 8, plus 6 is 14. And that's all negative. So his change in elevation totally would be negative 144.5. Now notice this last 0 at the end. We don't need it. So we could just say negative 144.5 feet was his elevation change. All right? We're adding decimals, whole numbers, and fractions. And you'll see that we have to convert fractions to decimals, maybe decimals to fractions sometimes, to perform the operations that we want. And you just have to remember the skills that you learned about how to convert fractions to decimals and decimals to fractions to make that happen. That's all we've got today. Have a great rest of your day. Don't forget to be awesome, and I will see you next time.